The polished silence of the Vance mansion, a home defined by wealth and precision, is shattered not by crisis, but by the arrival of Amani, a 10-year-old girl whose eyes hold an ancient wisdom. Facing the inexplicable decline of their son Elias, the wealthy couple Julian and Eleanor make a desperate and illogical bargain. They will take Amani in, relying on her quiet, strange gift to heal their child where modern medicine has failed. What begins as a cold transaction quickly thaws into an irrevocable family bond, as Amani's medicine, a blend of empathy and sacrifice, not only restores Elias but also reveals the emotional coldness that had settled over the entire house, ultimately forcing the Vances to confront the true meaning of possession and love. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The rain was an old, heavy drumbeat against the tall windows of the Vance home, blurring the view of the meticulously manicured lawn. Inside, the house was a study in cold, expensive silence, the kind that amplifies the quiet panic of its inhabitants. Eleanor Vance, 30, blonde, and dressed in cashmere that cost more than some people's monthly rent, stood by the mantelpiece. She held a cold teacup, her knuckles white. Across the room, Julian Vance, her handsome, equally anxious husband, was on his 5th call of the morning, speaking in the hushed, sterile tones he usually reserved for board meetings. Everything in their life was precise, successful, and controlled, except for the single devastating variable that was their son. Elias had been fading for 6 months, not with a diagnosable disease, but a creeping, insidious weariness the doctors termed failure to thrive. His skin was the color of old milk, and the light behind his eyes seemed to be retreating further every day. Julian ended his call, sighing a sharp, frustrated breath. That was Dr. Peterson. Another referral. Another specialist who will tell us it's psychosomatic and hand us another useless prescription. No, Eleanor said, the word barely a whisper. We've done all that, Julian. We've tried the clinics, the diets, the therapy. There is nothing left to try. Just as the silence settled back in, a sharp, insistent ringing cut through the house's automated chime, the sound of the doorbell. The maid, used to the Vances' rigid schedule, looked confused. "I'll get it," Julian muttered, welcoming the distraction. He opened the massive, polished oak door, expecting a delivery or a lost solicitor. Instead, he found a girl, barely a silhouette against the downpour. She was tiny, thin, and impossibly soaked. Her clothes were a mismatched patchwork, and her face, tilted up to meet his, was framed by a tangle of wet, dark braids. She looked no older than 10. Her eyes, though, held a quiet, steady intensity that arrested him. This was not a child begging for a dry spot. "Can I help you?" Julian asked, his voice defaulting to the polite, distant tone he used with strangers. The girl took a small, deliberate step onto the marble foyer. Water puddled around her worn sneakers. "My name is Amani," she said, her voice surprisingly low and clear, cutting through the rain's roar. "I know why your son is sick." Julian's controlled composure cracked. "Look, kid, I don't know who sent you, but you need to go home. We're not looking for money or anything else." Amani didn't flinch. Her gaze drifted past Julian, past Eleanor, and settled on a photograph on a nearby side table. A slightly out-of-focus picture of Elias, smiling brightly, taken before the shadow fell. "He's cold," Amani stated, a simple fact devoid of judgment. "The sickness is not in his body. It is just the absence of light. Your doctors can only read the illness. I can read the life that is left." Eleanor, drawn by the sound of the strange conversation, moved to the doorway. She saw Amani, soaked and small, yet utterly commanding. She saw Julian, speechless for the first time in their marriage. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with grief and a desperate, rising hope she hated. Amani turned her intense gaze to Eleanor, reading the desperation etched on her pale face. "I am a healer. Not with potions or books, but with time. I know how to bring the warmth back." She stepped fully into the foyer, meeting Eleanor's skeptical eyes. "You've exhausted everything else. Let me stay for a while. Let me have a place to sleep, food to eat, and a space near him. And I will heal him. When he is well, if you still wish for me to go, I will. But not before." The silence that followed was total. A desperate, wealthy woman, a pragmatic, bewildered man, and a small, resolute girl standing in a pool of rainwater, offering the impossible as a quiet, non-negotiable bargain. Julian looked at the water soaking his irreplaceable Persian rug. Eleanor looked at the child who had just offered her life back. Julian's first instinct was to call security. The situation was preposterous. A wet, 10-year-old squatter on his Italian marble, attempting to blackmail him with a proposition of faith healing. He started to reach for his phone, but the sight of Eleanor, her hand trembling as she slowly lowered the teacup, stopped him. "You're making this up," Eleanor whispered, her voice a raw mixture of accusation and pleading. "You read it somewhere. A book, a movie, a scam." Amani shifted her gaze, not defensive but utterly calm. "I have no television, no books about your son. I have only the knowledge of where the balance is broken. Your son's life force is leaking out, like water from a bowl with a hairline crack. Your medicine is only trying to patch the water. I know how to mend the bowl." Julian stepped forward, asserting the cold, professional authority that had built his fortune. "Amani, is it? We appreciate your concern, but we have the best doctors in the world working on this. We don't employ children, and we certainly don't engage in spiritual therapies." "You have tried everything that money can buy," Amani countered, her dark eyes steady. "I ask for nothing but what you already have in abundance: space and time." She looked down at her dripping clothes and then back at the spotless foyer. "The water will dry. The healing will not. But if you send me away, I will take the knowledge with me, and your son will be gone before the next season." The threat was delivered without malice, simply as an unavoidable consequence. It was the first time anyone had given them a definitive prognosis, and ironically, it was the only one they truly feared. Eleanor stepped away from the mantelpiece, her polished composure dissolving. She walked to Amani, a strange mix of disgust at the water pooling beneath the girl's feet and desperate maternal curiosity. She knelt, bringing her face level with the child's. "If we agree to this, for how long?" "Until he eats a full meal and laughs a genuine laugh," Amani said. "He must be whole, not just better." Julian finally dropped his phone into his pocket. His mind, trained for risk assessment, was running probabilities. The financial cost was negligible. The reputational risk, if anyone ever found out, was enormous. But the cost of doing nothing. "All right," Julian said, his voice flat. He walked over to Amani and extended his hand, not for a shake, but to point toward the inner hall. "You're not a prisoner here, but you are not to leave the grounds. You will have a room, you will be fed, and you will be supervised. And there will be no talk of this to anyone. This is a private arrangement, understood?" Amani did not take his hand. She simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through her small frame. The moment the agreement was sealed, the exhaustion seemed to catch up with her. Eleanor stood and signaled to the maid, who watched the strange transaction with wide, frightened eyes. "Show her to the blue guest room. And bring her some dry clothes. Something simple. Then bring her tea and soup to the room immediately." "No," Amani said, halting the maid. "Thank you, ma'am, but I cannot start in a room far from him. The healing must begin now. It needs closeness." "Where then?" Julian demanded. Amani pointed a small finger toward the massive antique chair tucked into the corner of the landing, directly outside Elias's closed bedroom door. "Right there. I will be his sentinel." Julian watched as the child, who had just negotiated shelter in a mansion, shuffled out of the expensive foyer and went to sit, wet and alone, in a dusty velvet chair outside his son's room, becoming a silent, dark sentinel in their bright, lifeless home. The transaction had been made, but for the life of him, Julian couldn't figure out who was paying the true price. The blue guest room was pristine, smelling faintly of lavender and disuse. Amani didn't even glance at the freshly laundered sheets the maid, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, had laid out. She took the dry clothes, a pair of simple gray joggers and a too large white sweatshirt, and changed in the bathroom, her movements quiet and economical. She did not go to the kitchen for the promised soup. Instead, she returned to her post, the velvet armchair outside Elias Vance's closed door. It was an antique piece, dark and worn, offering a subtle contrast to the blinding modernity of the hall. Amani sat, curling her thin legs up beneath the oversized sweatshirt. She did not sleep. She simply listened. She listened to the sounds that escaped the sealed room, the shallow, uneven rhythm of Elias's breathing, the periodic, stifled coughs, and the nearly imperceptible sound of his parents moving around inside. The first few hours were a test of the family's discipline and Amani's endurance. Julian passed first late that evening. He paused, seeing her small, still form under the soft glow of the wall sconce. He expected to find her asleep, or perhaps crying, regretting her bold arrival. Instead, her eyes were open, focused on nothing in particular. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice strained by a forced casualness. "Mrs. Chen can get you something." "No, sir," Amani replied, her voice soft but firm. "I need stillness. The house is too loud with worry. I must tune it out to hear him." Julian's face tightened with discomfort. He was unused to dealing with anything he couldn't purchase, negotiate, or dismiss. This girl was doing all three at once. He gave her a sharp, uncomfortable nod and retreated to the library, leaving her to her strange vigil. Eleanor came out hours later, near midnight. She had spent the last hour simply holding Elias's hand, praying uselessly to a god she hadn't believed in since her teens. The guilt was suffocating. She found Amani in the same position. Eleanor knelt beside the chair, ignoring the way her silk robe brushed the floor. "How can you hear anything?" Eleanor whispered. "The door is solid." Amani shifted slightly, leaning her head against the high back of the chair. "The body tells its story differently than words. Elias is not just sick in his blood. He is sick in his spirit. He is very, very lonely." The observation was a knife in Eleanor's heart. She and Julian had poured money and worry into Elias, but had they offered him anything but their high expectations? "He's never been alone," Eleanor insisted, instantly defensive. "He is alone in his suffering," Amani countered gently. "No one could meet him there. Until now." Eleanor stared at the child. She wanted to believe this was a delusion, a cruel game, but Amani's seriousness was undeniable. She saw the profound self-possession of the girl, the way she offered her insight not as a challenge, but as a simple, painful fact. "What is your plan?" Eleanor finally asked. "There is no schedule," Amani said. "I am waiting for the time when he will welcome me. I cannot push the warmth. He has to invite it in." Eleanor rose, feeling smaller and more inadequate than she had in years. She reached out, then hesitated. She wanted to touch Amani, to thank her, or maybe to confirm that she was real. Instead, she simply said, "Good night, Amani," and walked away, leaving the silent sentinel to her duty. Amani did not respond. She simply closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen deeper, letting the rhythm of Elias's fragile life become the sole, soft pulse in the great empty house. The true work had begun. The moment Amani had been waiting for arrived 2 days later, not with a burst of drama, but with a sound more powerful than any illness, the quiet scrape of a door latch. Julian and Eleanor were in the kitchen, meticulously avoiding the subject of the small, silent girl camped on their landing, when Elias emerged. He was pale and fragile, wrapped in a blanket, his 10-year-old body looking desperately undersized. He saw Amani immediately. She was still in the velvet chair, seemingly part of the furniture, but her eyes were open and watchful. Elias hesitated, leaning heavily against the door frame. He had been aware of her presence, a foreign warmth on the cold, distant perimeter of his illness, but he hadn't acknowledged it. "Hello," Elias whispered, the word dry and scratchy and used. Amani unfolded herself from the chair, rising with a fluid grace that surprised Julian, who had just come to the bottom of the stairs. She approached Elias slowly, giving him all the space he needed. "Hello, Elias," she replied. "I've been waiting for you." "Are you the new nurse?" he asked, tilting his head. "I'm Amani," she said simply. "I'm a friend of the house." Elias took a faltering step toward her. His eyes, usually dull and shadowed, held a flicker of curiosity. "Why are you always sitting there?" "Because your room has too much sadness in it," Amani explained gently. "I was waiting outside to catch the good parts so they wouldn't escape." The explanation made no sense to Julian, who was frozen on the steps, yet it seemed to resonate profoundly with Elias. He looked past Amani toward the dark mouth of his room, then back at her. "It's quiet in here," Elias said, looking down the long, silent hallway. "It is," Amani agreed. "But stillness is not the same as quiet. Your body needs quiet." Elias swayed slightly. Amani didn't rush forward or hover. She simply stood her ground, offering a steady, unwavering point of contact. "I don't like the sun anymore," Elias confessed. "It makes my head hurt." "Then let's find a place where the light is gentle," Amani suggested. She turned and began to walk, not toward the living room or the playroom, but toward the rarely used glass sunroom that opened onto a secluded, overgrown corner of the garden. Elias, without instruction or coaxing, followed her. Julian and Eleanor watched, speechless, as their son, who had refused to leave his room for 2 weeks, walked out of their line of sight, following a girl he had just met. They followed them a safe distance behind. They found the children sitting on a low bench in the sunroom, sheltered by ferns and ivy. Amani had taken Elias's hand, her small dark fingers laced completely around his pale, thin ones. Her eyes were closed, her face utterly still, concentrating. Elias leaned his head against the cool glass, his own eyes drifting shut. He looked less strained than he had in months. Julian and Eleanor watched from the doorway, fear and awe warring in their chests. After a long, silent minute, Amani opened her eyes and looked straight at the parents. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost a sigh. "The warmth is very low," she murmured. "It will take time." But he let me hold it. She was tired, visibly, profoundly tired. A shadow seemed to have passed over her face, leaving her briefly hollowed out. She had, Julian realized with a sudden chilling certainty, just absorbed a fragment of his son's coldness. She hadn't performed a trick or a spell. She had simply performed a transfer of burdens. "What can we do?" Eleanor whispered, the question escaping her before she could censor it. She wasn't asking a caregiver, she was asking a fellow laborer. Amani turned back to Elias, whose breathing had evened out. "Do not rush him. Do not worry near him. And you must not ask me to leave. Not yet." She leaned her head against Elias's shoulder, and within seconds, both children were asleep, a fragile, unlikely pair in the cool, silent sunroom. The healing was not a miracle, it was an exchange, and Amani had just paid the first installment. Amani's presence quickly established a new, strange equilibrium in the Vance home. She didn't officially move into the house, she simply integrated herself into the spaces around Elias. Her permanent post remained the armchair by his door, but her day involved quiet, deliberate movement. The sunroom, the garden, and Elias's bedside. Julian and Eleanor found themselves navigating their own home as though it were a fragile museum exhibit, constantly mindful of the small sentinel. The new routine. The healing was not a single event, it was a slow, mutual realignment. Amani had 3 unbreakable rules for the Vances, and she enforced them with the quiet authority of a seasoned practitioner. No doctors. They search for the problem with instruments, Amani explained. We need stillness to allow the solution to grow. Julian, against all logic, honored this, canceling appointments with an embarrassed stiffness. No worry near him. Worry is cold, she stated. It clings to him. If you must be afraid, take it far away, to the library, to the car. Do not bring it into his light. This was the hardest rule for Eleanor. She found herself retreating to her bathroom to weep silently into a towel, unable to express her fear near her own son. No rush. The life force is not a clock. If you ask him to be well, you are asking him to perform. You must simply let him be. Julian, the pragmatist, watched. His initial skepticism was replaced by a clinical curiosity. He started seeing the small, almost imperceptible shifts in Elias. A twitch of a smile when Amani told him a strange, quiet story about moss and river stones. The way his hand, usually clenched tight, would relax in hers. One afternoon, Julian found Amani standing by a dusty, rarely opened window in the hallway. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to keep the impatience out of his voice. "Letting the air move," she replied without turning. "The house is too clean, sir. It has no life smell. Just polish and chemicals. Elias needs things that are alive." Julian was thrown. He was proud of his immaculately sterile home. "What do you suggest?" "We need to maintain hygiene." Amani turned and looked at him, her gaze clear and challenging. "He needs to put his feet on the ground. Not on marble or carpet. He needs dirt." Julian felt his jaw tighten. Dirt in his house was an offense. But he looked at the fragile boy in the room next door and he relented. The first step. The next day, Julian had a groundskeeper discreetly clear a small patch in the overgrown corner of the garden near the sunroom. Amani led Elias out, bundled in his blanket. She helped him sit down and then, slowly, she encouraged him to do something radical, to take off his socks. Elias hesitated, his toes pale and sensitive. "It's medicine," Amani murmured, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The life that is left in you is thirsty. The ground is offering to share. With a shaky breath, Elias placed his thin, cold feet on the cool, damp earth. A profound silence fell over the small clearing. Julian and Eleanor watched from the sunroom window. They saw Elias wince, then slowly his toes curl into the soil. A faint flush, the first color they'd seen on his cheeks in weeks, spread across his face. Amani closed her eyes, linking her hand with his, sending her own vibrant, steady energy into him. Eleanor reached for Julian's hand, her carefully manicured fingers clutching his with desperate force. "She's drawing the cold out," Eleanor whispered, tears finally slipping down her cheeks, not of grief but of profound, terrifying hope. "She's letting it hurt her." Julian didn't answer. He simply watched the two small figures, one giving, one receiving, and understood with a certainty that shook the foundations of his wealth, that Amani was not a guest. She was a sacrifice. And the depth of the debt they were incurring was beyond measure. The slow integration of Amani and her quiet medicine began to reshape the Vance household entirely. The meticulous, scheduled sterility gave way to something softer, slightly less controlled, and infinitely more alive. Eleanor, who had always viewed her kitchen as a display, found herself working alongside Mrs. Chin, boiling water for the simple, pungent herbal infusions Amani requested. She learned to make a broth, not just a recipe, focusing on the warmth and nourishment over the presentation. She started listening to the house instead of merely managing it. Julian, meanwhile, found his highly ordered mind utterly derailed. He tried at first to quantify Amani's process, taking notes on the length of her sessions, the color returning to Elias's lips, and the depth of his sleep. But the data was useless. The healing followed no algorithm. It was tied to the weather, the mood, and Amani's own unpredictable energy levels. The most profound shift was in the relationship between the two children. They were inseparable, bound by a shared language of silence and subtle gestures. Amani did not play with Elias in the traditional sense. She simply was with him. She sat with him while he ate small, reluctant spoonfuls of soup, talking about the shapes the clouds made or the patterns of light on the wall. One evening, Eleanor found Amani outside Elias's room, hunched over, her arms wrapped tightly around her midsection. She wasn't crying, but she was shaking violently. "Amani?" Eleanor rushed forward, kneeling instantly. "What is it? Are you ill?" Amani gasped, her small body convulsing slightly. "It's the cold," she managed, her voice tight and distant. "He had a bad night. The fear was thick in him and I pulled it out. It settles in my stomach." Eleanor, her years of polished restraint dissolving completely, lifted Amani into her arms. The child was impossibly light, like a bundle of sticks. She carried her to the blue guest room, finally putting her in the bed that had been waiting. "Julian!" Eleanor screamed, her voice echoing down the hall. Julian arrived seconds later, finding his wife hovering over Amani, stroking the girl's fevered brow. "She's burning up," Eleanor said, terrified. "We have to call a doctor, Julian. Now." "No," Amani croaked, pushing a weak hand against Eleanor's arm. "No doctors. Just quiet. A blanket." Julian stared at the girl. He saw not the powerful healer but a vulnerable, suffering child. He knelt beside his wife, placing a hand on the thin blanket over Amani. He was filled with a searing, protective rage, not at her, but at the world that had put this burden on a 10-year-old. "We cannot let her do this," Julian said to Eleanor, his voice low and fierce. "We can't just stand by while she sacrifices herself. But if we interfere, Elias..." Eleanor's voice trailed off, stuck between her two desperate loyalties. Amani's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Julian, then at Eleanor, an ancient, knowing look in her gaze. "The healing is never just for one," Amani whispered, her breath shallow. "The cold was in the whole house. Now it is just in me. Soon it will be gone entirely." She closed her eyes, exhausted by the effort of speaking. Julian and Eleanor stayed by her side through the long, agonizing night. They were no longer observing a magical phenomenon, they were caring for a sick child. They brought cool cloths and water, and they spoke to each other in low, worried tones, finally allowing the worry to exist in the blue room far from Elias. By dawn, the fever had broken. Amani was drenched in sweat, but the tension had left her face. She looked like a tired, normal child. Eleanor tucked the blanket around her shoulders, tears blurring her vision. She touched Amani's cheek no longer with gratitude for a service, but with the consuming, fierce tenderness of a mother. Julian watched his wife, a profound and irreversible realization settling over him. Elias was getting better, yes, but in the process, Amani had broken through the wealthy, insulated shell of their marriage and their home. She hadn't just healed their son, she had given them a piece of themselves they never knew was missing. The question of whether they could let her go was ceasing to be a practical one. It was becoming a question of survival. The crisis in the Blue Room marked a permanent shift in the Vance household. Julian and Eleanor had been forced, by the sight of Amani's suffering, to drop their veneer of transactional oversight and assume the genuine, messy roles of caregivers. Elias was now visibly, undeniably improving. The dull pallor had left his skin, replaced by the faint, healthy glow of childhood. He was not yet robust, but he was present. He sat at the kitchen table, asking Mrs. Chen for an extra piece of toast, and he followed Amani outside to the muddy patch of earth, where they would spend hours in silent, shared communion with the life returning to the soil. The milestone that Amani had promised was reached one cold, sunny afternoon. Elias and Amani were in the sunroom, building a haphazard tower of books. Elias reached for a large, dusty tome, missed, and the entire structure collapsed with a magnificent, echoing crash. Elias didn't just smile. He threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't the weak, forced sound they'd been coaxing out of him for months. It was a rich, genuine, uninhibited eruption of joy. It was the sound of a 10-year-old boy, cured and whole. Julian and Eleanor, standing near the doorway, froze. They looked at each other, their eyes flooding with relief and awe. The sound was so foreign, so utterly miraculous, that it felt like a physical shock wave in their quiet home. Amani looked at Elias, a triumphant, exhausted smile touching her lips. She had done it. The bargain was complete. That evening, the house felt lighter than it had in years. They ate dinner, all four of them, at the vast mahogany table, a piece of furniture usually reserved for holidays and formal business. Elias spoke more in that hour than he had in the last 6 months combined, recounting an adventure he and Amani had planned in the overgrown garden. After the children had gone to bed, Amani, for the first time, sleeping soundly in the comfortable blue room, not on the hard velvet chair, Julian poured 2 glasses of cognac, though neither of them wanted it. They sat in the library, the silence between them no longer strained, but weighted with gratitude. "He's well," Eleanor whispered, touching the rim of her glass. "He's truly well." "She fulfilled the terms," Julian said, the pragmatist trying one last, futile time to gain control of the situation. He pushed a plain white envelope across the polished desk. Eleanor stared at the envelope. It was thick, obviously containing a substantial amount of money, an attempt to square the ledger of an impossible life-saving debt. "Is that it?" Eleanor asked, her voice laced with sudden, sharp distaste. "You're going to give her this and tell her she has to go?" "We made a deal, Ilara," Julian insisted, running a hand through his hair. "She said when he was well, if we wished her to leave, she would." "And do you wish her to leave?" Eleanor's eyes were fierce. "Look at our son, Julian. Look at us. Before she came, we were perfect, successful, and drowning. She is the warmth that thawed this entire house. You cannot just pay for that." Julian slumped into his chair, the last of his resistance crumbling. "No," he admitted, the word a rough admission of defeat and truth. I can't imagine the house without her. She's not a healer, Eleanor. She's family." He looked at the money, then at his wife, and the truth of their immense, complicated attachment became undeniable. He finally understood the depth of the bargain. He hadn't just agreed to keep her until Elias was healed. He had agreed to let her fill the terrifying emotional void they hadn't realized they had. Julian slowly, deliberately, picked up the envelope and tore it in half, then into quarters, letting the worthless paper flutter onto his desk. "The transaction is void," he declared, the businessman in him dissolving the last remaining contract. "We decide never to let her go. Now we just have to make sure she decides to stay." The morning after their conversation in the library, the atmosphere in the Vance house was charged with a new, quiet determination. The transactional phase was over. The crisis was past. Now began the delicate, crucial work of becoming a family. Julian was the first to act. He didn't speak to Amani about the money or the contract. Instead, he went to his home office, but his work was not stocks or acquisitions. He spent the morning speaking with his lawyer, not about a settlement but about adoption and guardianship. The process would be complex, given Amani's unknown background and their lack of a pre-existing relationship, but Julian was relentless. He was accustomed to navigating impossible systems, and for the first time he was doing it purely for love. Eleanor approached the transition through care. She dismissed the cook and insisted that Mrs. Chen focus solely on the house and laundry. Eleanor herself began cooking for Amani and Elias, making simple, nourishing food, roast chicken, real vegetables, and the kind of comforting homemade desserts she hadn't touched since childhood. She found Amani in the sunroom, curled up reading a large picture book with Elias. Amani looked up, her expression calm. "Good morning, ma'am," Amani said. "Elias is going to try to walk down to the creek today. Just a little way." "That sounds wonderful, Amani," Eleanor replied, sitting down across from them. She hesitated, then placed a small velvet-covered box on the table. "Amani," she began, her voice unusually soft, "I know the agreement was that you would leave and I know your healing is complete. But Julian and we can't imagine our lives without you now." Amani looked at her steadily, her eyes holding the deep wisdom of a child who had seen too much. She knew the conversation was coming. "The cold is gone, ma'am," Amani said. "The house is warm now." "It's warm because you are here," Eleanor countered, her voice catching. She pushed the box closer. "This isn't payment. It's a key. A symbol." Amani slowly opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of cream velvet, was a delicate silver locket. It was simple, elegant, and utterly personal. "It belonged to my grandmother," Eleanor explained, tears finally welling in her eyes. "It's not valuable in money, but it's valuable in belonging. I want you to have it. I want you to know that you are not a guest or a healer or a ward. You are our daughter." She reached out and took Amani's hands. "Julian is making sure the law understands this. But you are the one who needs to tell us. Do you want to stay here, Amani? Do you want to be part of our family? Not because of Elias, but because of us." Amani looked at the locket, tracing the cool silver with her finger. She looked at Eleanor, whose grief and desperation had been replaced by a fierce, fragile hope. Then she looked at Elias, whose hand was resting on her knee, waiting patiently. She thought of the cold, uncertain life she had lived before, the transient homes, the neglect, the constant threat of having to move on. Here there was stability, protection, and a warmth that was not a temporary favor, but a palpable, deep commitment. Amani closed the box, clutching it to her chest. She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes shining with the simple, immense gratitude of a child finally finding safe harbor. "I want to stay," Amani said, the words a quiet, powerful affirmation. "The cold is gone from me too. This is where I belong." The unspoken promise was sealed. Eleanor didn't just hug her. She gathered the small girl fully into her arms, holding her tightly, fiercely. She was no longer just the lady of the house. She was a mother, made whole by the very child who had come to save her son. Julian entered the sunroom just then, holding a thick folder, the initial paperwork for the adoption. He saw Amani clutched in Eleanor's embrace, the small locket box secure in her hand. He didn't need to ask for the answer. He simply smiled, the first genuine deep-seated relaxation he'd felt in years settling over his face. The cost was immaterial. The risk was forgotten. Their family was complete. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.